Good evening, Plano, Texas Photography Club. This is Bill Buchanan, your guest judge and commentator for the evening. Once again, I have the pleasure of judging your images. I've always been impressed with the quality and the variety of images that you folks continue to exhibit. I've been a member of my camera club, the Photographic Guild, up in the Detroit area, and PSA for almost 40 years now. In our club, we use a judging system for each judge votes on the interest value, on the composition, and technique. And as I've found throughout the years in judging at club level and PSA international salons, and particularly in PSA salons, because there's such a large quantity of images to be judged, the first thing that hits a judge is the impact value of an image. Once you get over the initial impact of that image, then we proceed to analyze the composition and perhaps go on to the technical aspects of the image, whether or not it's in focus, the color is correct, and things such as that, and also how it may be presented, be it a print or a projected image. So we begin with the beginner's class, beginning with the image titled Oklahoma City Memorial. I gave this a score of 10. It is an interesting picture based upon the particular location, the memorial itself, the reflection. However, the horizon line is going somewhat through the center of the picture, and I would like to see the horizon line change just a bit to either have more sky or more of the reflecting pond. The other element that I found a little problem with is that the image itself seemed a little bit washed out, and I would think that through a little bit of enhancement in Photoshop elements or Lightroom, we could control the density or the saturation or the brightness of some of the bright areas of this image and give it a little more impact. The next image is titled I Have Your Back. Gave this a score of 10. This was an interesting picture from the standpoint of interest value, from the standpoint of the firefighters fighting a fire. However, in this case, I would have liked to have seen a little more of the area or the fire itself, perhaps even full length of the firefighters, so you could see what they were, the fire they were fighting. Just step back a little bit or zoom back your lens a bit and include a little more subject in this particular case. The next image was titled Metal Mesh Umbrella, and I gave that a score of 11. This was kind of an interesting black and white image. I like the particular pattern on the underside of the umbrella. However, what I would like to have seen is to have the point where all of the lines intersect moved up to either the upper 1/3 right corner or the 1/3 left corner at the top. I think that would bring the composition into a better alignment for you. The next image, titled 9 Lives, I gave that a score of 11. And the picture had a fair amount of interest value, human interest, in the fact that this cat has been rescued from some situation, perhaps a fire or something of that nature. What I would like to have seen is a little more interreaction between the person that did the rescuing and the cat itself, where in this case we only see a part of the arms and the gloved hands of the person that did the rescue. The next image, titled Fresh Honey, by Vijay Barsundaram. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I found very interesting. I gave it a score of 11 and also gave it an honorable mention. I like the composition of this. The image seemed to go from a dark area on the left side to a bright area, and then out on the end of this little branch or twig, whatever, is our main subject, and the background is out of focus, and it had some nice composition and nice impact to it. The next image was titled My Green Heaven. This was a score of 12. This was a third place image for Jim Walsh. I found this interesting treatment of this insect from the standpoint of being backlit. It provided a lot of impact for me. The composition was fairly well handled, and the interesting fact is that it was backlit. However, I think in this case I would like to have seen just a touch of fill light in the foreground to just add a little bit of detail to the wings of the insect. The next image, titled Reflection, received a score of 13, and I gave it a second place, and this was for Kathy Lynn. The image had a lot of impact to it. What the standpoint of the composition was well handled. The exposure is right on. There's good texture in the white, and this is all added up to a pleasing reflection in the water. So that was one of the reasons that I scored this one as high as I did. And finally, our first place image, Waiting to Ride, I gave that a score of 14. And this was for Leslie Johnson. It's a very simple picture. The colors are very simple. They're pleasing. The composition has been well handled. One little thing that I probably would have done to this is I may have cropped just a little bit off of the left side of the image to eliminate that little bit of distraction on the left side there, just a little bit of texture over there, and it isn't something that would kill the picture. I just felt that just a little bit of texture merging with the left edge of the picture was a little bit of a distraction, but overall the picture was very well handled. Our next group of images is from the intermediate group, beginning with the image titled Roses on the Diagonal. I gave this a score of 9. The colors were quite unique in this picture. However, the flowers themselves appear to be crowded in here, and I believe in this case less would be to the maker's advantage. Looking at my monitor, the flowers do appear to be a little bit soft. I don't know if this was intentional by the maker, but it just appeared to be a little bit on the soft side. So, maybe that's something that you may want to look at, perhaps if it was shot with camera on a tripod or handheld, something you want to be careful of in the future. The next image, titled Morning in the Garden, a score of 9. Picture had a fair amount of impact. The stark contrast between the flower and the background was somewhat interesting. I believe in this particular case I may have cropped in a little more and eliminated some of the background just to strengthen the composition. The next image, titled Reflection, received a score of 9. Kind of an unusual picture with a young lady looking at herself in the reflection of a pane of glass. And I kept looking at this image and wondering, how could we enhance this picture? And one thought came to mind would be to physically reverse the image so you would see and be able to read the writing on her shirt in the reflection. It's not an idea that would certainly kill the picture, but it was just a question that came into my mind. The other little thing that I saw here was that bright area in the upper right-hand corner. That could have perhaps been toned down in your post-processing technique just to take a little bit of the bright area away. Perhaps if she would have stood a little closer, you could have tightened up the crop a bit also. The next image is titled Reflection. I gave this a score of 10. The picture itself appears a little bit soft. The horizon line is going through the center of the picture. I may have decided to crop a little more of the foreground and bring the horizon line down and perhaps give it a little more sky. I don't know if this may have been an HDR type of image, but the image itself seemed to lack some detail in the structure itself. The next image, titled Rare Cacti Bloom, a score of 10. Very interesting picture, nice close-up showing a lot of detail. Here again we have a situation with composition. Do we put it in the center? Do we move it around a little bit? And I think the maker has done a fairly admirable job placing the flower where he has the attention is brought to the center of the flower itself. The next image, titled Big Bend, a score of 10. Maker here has chosen a roadside scene. In this case, we have some dark shadows that perhaps through some work in Photoshop, you could have opened up the shadow areas. There's good overall saturation, and the road certainly acts as a nice lead-in line into the scene. Our next image is I Wish I Had a V8, score of 11. It's an interesting picture. I've had the opportunity to photograph quite a few automobiles within the past couple of years, and certainly these offer the opportunity for some very interesting compositions, and in this particular case it almost becomes an abstract scene with the horizontal lines of the grille and the shape of the V8 and the Ford logo. Nice placement of the center of interest, which I would call the blue oval and the V8 on the left side of the image. It adds nice balance, and the brightness of the area does draw the viewer's attention in that direction. The next image is General Store. This is an interesting picture going to the retro look where we have an old catalog and some old shoes. And the maker's done a nice job with the lighting. It's very soft, has some nice modeling to it, and has a very nice old quality feeling to it. The next image, titled Baltic Steeple, gave a score of 11. The maker in this case has taken an unusual and interesting viewpoint of this steeple. I like the idea of including the flower pots on the ledge. That adds some interest to it. Perhaps if you would just crop a little bit off of the bottom of that image to eliminate that little red spot underneath the steeple itself, it's just a little bit of a distraction to me, but I like the viewpoint. It's an unusual viewpoint, and the lines of the overhang and the flower pots, just everything ties together very nicely. The next image, titled Lotus Flower by Ron Lin, I gave a score of 12 and an HM. A very nice picture, very nicely done, a nice pleasing background that does not overpower the image, and the position of the flower in the scene has been nicely handled. The next image, titled The Journey by Min Yang, I also gave it a score of 12 and an honorable mention. The picture itself has a lot of interest to it. From the standpoint of someone involved in an activity, the background may be a little bit bright, and I'm just wondering if a little bit of cropping, a little bit off of the bottom and a little bit from the left side to eliminate that little yellow line going up there, and then with perhaps a little bit of post-processing work to perhaps give it a vignette effect and darken the edges. I think that could help this picture quite a bit. The next image, titled Beauty of Monarch by Safatyana Starnad. Very pleasing picture of the monarch butterfly. I think in this particular case, there's a bit of an exposure problem. The butterfly itself, I feel, is properly exposed. It's sharp and in focus, but the bright areas of the flower are a little bit of a distraction. I'm almost wondering if you could not crop the stem of that flower out and just show the edge of the flower that the monarch would be resting on. also through some of your post-processing work, I think you could have toned down the brightness of that flower and not have made it such a bright area in the scene. But overall, pleasing composition, nicely handled. The next image, titled Make My Day by Chris Cahoe, I gave a score of 14 and also a second place award. I thought this was a very strong portrait. What I liked about this was the unique lighting on the picture. The maker obviously has used some creativity in placing the lights. The strong light on the left side of the model's face definitely brings out a lot of the texture and the detail, and even to the facial muscles of the subject. It looks like a little bit of added grunge effect to this image, which has also given it some added interest. And finally, the image titled Splash and Dash by Don Champlin. I gave a score of 15 and also a first place. This is an outstanding picture. Don was able to capture a peak of activity here. The dog is razor sharp. The fur is just sharp. The water is sharp. The background is muted and out of focus. And there's just a tremendous amount of impact. And if anything, to improve this, you may have cropped a bit off of the right side. Would have helped just a little bit, but the overall sharpness and the impact is what made this picture score the way it did. Our next group of pictures is from the advanced group, and we begin with an image titled The Day Before the Bird Groomer Appointment. There was a fair amount of interest value in here, but what was somewhat distracting to me was the bright area at the bottom of the picture and the bird's feathers. Not knowing the exact location or conditions, it appears that this may have been in a partially shadowed area where light may have been coming through some trees. The background is not distracting at all. As a matter of fact, the background may be a little bit on the bright side. That could have perhaps been controlled with a little bit of post-processing. Overall, a decent attempt here. The next image is titled Ellison. I gave a score of 10. There's a fair amount of interest value with this picture. Decent composition, the lighting is not that bad. However, the one thing that has me questioning are the two ribbons on top of the child's head, whether or not this was ribbons in the hair or what. They raised that question, at least in my mind, what is the green ribbon for? So I think in a case if the maker would have removed the ribbons or moved them out of the way, I think it could have helped this picture quite a bit. The next image, titled Brighten Your Little Corner of the World, I gave a score of 10. The idea of including the flowers alongside the railroad track and the rusty wheel had a fair amount of interest value. I would think that the composition could have been improved if the image was cropped a little bit from the bottom and eliminate a little bit of that bright area at the bottom of the scene. If you look at the slide or the image as it's projected, you see the bright areas and your eye keeps being drawn to the brightest area of the scene. And I think it's just perhaps a bit of cropping, perhaps a little bit of burning in or toning down those edges would hold the viewer's interest back at the flowers and the wheel itself. The next image is titled Dusty Trail. I gave a score of 11. It had some good interest value to it, with the person standing here in the roadway watching some activity going on in the background. And the only question that was left in my mind in looking at this picture is what raised the dust? Was it a car? Was it a race car? A wagon? Someone on a motorcycle? So there's that question in my mind of what caused the dust. Good composition. I like the placement of the person in the red. That certainly helped pull your attention in there. But my eye just drifts out into that area of the field and the dust itself. The next image, titled Dazzling Glass, I gave a score of 11. Very nice composition with the glassware, nice colors. I like the placement of the subject on the reflective surface. That all ties together. But in this case, I think the maker could have eliminated one or two pieces of glassware. In this case, I believe less glassware would have strengthened the overall interest value of the picture. The colors are very nicely handled, and that was one of the things that I appreciated with this particular image. The next image is titled Peace After the Storm. I gave that a score of 11. And it's kind of an interesting picture. After I viewed this full screen on my monitor, I realized what the maker had done, and I compliment the maker for seeing something in a reflection and turning it in such a way that it became perhaps an attractive, almost abstract type of picture. Nicely done, good colors, and nice composition. The next image, titled Just Another Norwegian Fjord, I gave it a score of 11. And this was an interesting picture of the ship going into the fjord. The large area on the left side could have been opened up to shadows just a little bit. I would probably like to have seen that bright area in the upper left toned down just a little bit to hold the viewer's attention back towards the boat and the bright area of the fjord in the foreground. The next image, titled Towing a String of Canoes on the Rio Negro, I gave a score of 11. Very interesting picture, and I say that because of what I would call somewhat of a layer cake effect, with the boat and the canoes being towed behind it. Almost forms a vertical line, and then we have the vertical line of the horizon and the clouds and everything going almost in a vertical pattern towards the top of the image. I would probably try to crop just a little bit from the bottom and make it more of a panorama. I think something like that could have given it a little more impact just by eliminating a little bit of the bottom of the picture. Our next image, titled Maine Fresh Fish. This was by Amy Wilson. I gave this a score of 10, and I found this to be an interesting picture from the standpoint of the added texture to the image, just a little unique quality. The fisherman obviously is concentrating on his work here. Everything just works together. The one thing that I questioned with this picture is, would it have worked better as a vertical if you would have cropped a portion of the right and the left side of the picture? So that's something that you may want to look at if you were to redo this picture. The color and the texture, I felt, gave this image a lot of impact. The next picture, titled Kitten by Jim Shannon, I gave this an HM and a score of 12. An interesting picture because the model is placed against a white background. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, is to get a pure white background, but the only problem I saw here is that the hair of the model was just a little bit overexposed, a little bit too hot. Perhaps with a little bit of post-processing work, this could have been controlled with either Lightroom or Photoshop, something such as that. But I felt some of the detail in the model's hair was a little bit blown out. The next image, titled Starry Night. This is by Marie Hansen, score of 12. I gave this third place. I found this picture to be extremely interesting, with the photographer taking a long exposure to capture the stars in the nighttime sky. This is something that I have been trying recently, and fortunately our maker here was able to capture a large number of stars, and the placement of the tree, the lighting on the tree, added to the overall impact and also to the composition. The one thing that you might want to try, and this is something that I've found trying these types of pictures, is you really have to work at the color balance, and sometimes you almost have to force the sky to go from perhaps a muddy brown to a good rich blue that we may associate with a starlit sky. But you've done a nice job with this one. And going on to our next image, titled Mask, a second place for Bud Barlow. I gave a score of 13. I like the composition of this picture. Again, it's very simple, a background that is very plain and not distracting, and a lot of texture in the flower itself. So very nicely done and well deserving of the second place award. And finally, our first place award goes to Peter Liu. This is titled Pacific Moment, and I gave it a score of 14. And I like the composition of this picture, with the people sitting on the bench overlooking the bluff of the ocean, the shoreline, and the overall colors I found to be very pleasing, very warm and inviting. So it was a very nice presentation, and the fact that Peter did present this in a panorama format I found to be extremely interesting. Our final class is the master class, and we begin with a picture titled Sunrise After the Rains. I scored this as a 9. There's some potential in here. I compliment the maker for getting out early with the sunrise, especially after the rain, because the wet pavement has provided a nice lead-in line. However, the image itself suffers in a couple of areas. The blocked up shadow areas could have been opened up a little bit to provide some detail. Also, I think the sky could have been enhanced a little bit in some post-processing work. Overall, it's a relatively decent picture. Just a couple of things that needed to be done that might improve the impact value. Our next image is titled Reflections. I gave this a score of 9. I liked the overall idea of the reflection. However, the shoreline with the boulders does lead your eye back to the cabin and the red boat in the background. But what I find a little bit disturbing is the foreground itself. With the beautiful reflection, it's almost too bright, and perhaps through the use of either a graduated neutral density filter, that may have been controlled a little more. Also, I think perhaps a little bit of work with perhaps either the contrast or the vibrance settings in post-processing may have helped somewhat here. The next image is titled A View from a Ghost Town House. I gave this a score of 10. The maker has an interesting picture here, shot through perhaps a bay window of an old abandoned ghost town or something of that nature. The fact that there's 3 vehicles out on that road, my eye wants to settle on one vehicle, and there's 3 of them, so my attention is drawn to 3 different vehicles instead of one. That could have been just wait for one vehicle to come along and perhaps take multiple images. The other thing that I think could have helped this picture substantially is if you were working on a tripod where you could have taken perhaps multiple exposures, or even to attempt an HDR effect, thus bringing out some substantial detail in the shadow areas. That in itself would be a tremendous help for this picture. The next image is titled Storm over Cabo. I gave this a score of 10. In this case, we have a storm coming in over a resort area, and I would like to see less sky and perhaps more foreground. Without knowing the exact condition or what may be in the foreground, kind of difficult to make that call. But our horizon line is almost going through the center of this picture, and I would just prefer to perhaps see the camera tilted down just a little bit to include more of the foreground and less of the sky. Even though the sky and the storm cloud is perhaps the predominant part of the picture, we do have that bright area in the upper left-hand corner that is drawing your eye up there. So again, perhaps through some post-processing, you may darken that area, give it a little more contrast, things such as that. The next image is titled Born 1863 and Going Strong. I gave this a score of 10. Interesting picture of an ancient tortoise. I would like to see just a little bit closer photograph of this. I know he's not going to move around much on you, but the camera angle sometimes means a lot. The maker did get down low to the ground, which helps in this case. But on the left side of the picture is some material that could perhaps be cropped out. Perhaps that may improve the composition too, because right now his head is almost in the center of the picture. And then another thing you may think of doing is consider darkening the shell of the turtle. And I think by doing that, you would bring more attention back towards the head of the tortoise. Our next image is titled After the Rain. I gave this a score of 11. A very interesting picture of a lighthouse, beautiful reflection in the water. The only element that I see here is the lighthouse itself is somewhat centrally located. Whether or not you could have moved the lighthouse a little closer to the right side of the image, just to get it somewhat out of the center of the picture, could have helped this. But overall, it has beautiful lighting, beautiful reflection, and excellent colors. Our next image is titled Jordan. I gave it a score of 11. I like this picture from the standpoint of the antique look, the soft pastel colors, the pleasing position of the model. It just has a lot of nice feeling to it with nice lines, and the position of the model in the frame. Everything just flows together and is a very pleasing picture to look at. Our next image is titled Lobster Boys, and I gave this a score of 11. I like the idea of the row of lobster boys, and everything is in a nice row here. And the one lobster boy that becomes our center of interest is obviously the one on the far left side of the picture. The one item that perhaps disturbs me a little bit is the fact that that particular lobster boy is so close to the edge of the picture. I'm thinking of the fact that if we perhaps crop maybe some of the lobster boys on the right side to just strengthen the composition a little bit. It's just a thought on my behalf, not knowing what may be on the left side of the picture, but the clever idea by the photographer and the placement of that one particular boy, which is at a different level than the rest of them, it does become our center of interest. Good exposure and well handled. The next image is titled St. Nectan's Glen. This is an interesting picture with the waterfall coming through an opening in the rock formation, and I've somewhat torn with the thought of the waterfall going through the center of the picture. I would like to see the waterfall a little closer to the right side of the image. I also think that you could perhaps do a little bit of post-processing to increase the greens in the picture. Also a little bit of edge darkening, and then while you're at it, you may want to tone down a bit of the waterfall that is in the upper right-hand corner. And it certainly wouldn't hurt to open up the shadow area a little bit in your post-processing. The next image is titled The Trona Pinnacles, scored 11 by Dennis Frecci. I like this one. I gave it an honorable mention. It has a very pleasing composition. Dennis got out there either late in the day or early in the morning, but the long shadows and the composition of the pinnacles all lead to that one pinnacle that is the largest one on the left side of the image, and that becomes our strong center of interest. Very nicely done, excellent color, and good strong contrast, making it an attractive image. Our next image is titled Splash. I gave this a score of 12 and also an honorable mention. This is by James Stover. Very interesting picture. The colors are nice and bold, and this is one of those cases where you are stuck with a center of interest that is right in the center of the picture. But the impact and the interest value of this works well, particularly with the water bubble that is at the top, almost highlighted with that red area in the background, and then all of the concentric circles around the water splash itself hold the viewer's interest. Only thought I may have would be to add some edge darkening to just darken the edges all the way around to hold the viewer's attention into the center of the picture. Our next image is titled Bryce Sunrise. It had a score of 12. I gave this a third place, and this is by Larry Peterborg. The picture has a lot of interest value. Obviously, the snow and the early morning light work well together, particularly out in Red Rock Country and here in Bryce. The sky is not overpowering, and it has a pleasing feel to it. And even though there's a lot of similar items in the picture, my eye is drawn to that portion of the picture in the upper 1/3 left corner, in that one rock formation. Very pleasing all-around picture. Our next picture is titled Cavalry Life. This was by Lois Lehman. This had a score of 13, and I gave it a second place award. Very interesting picture with various elements relating to time in our history, with trumpets and water canteen, book, glasses. Everything ties together, telling a story. Now, the only downside that I see, and this could be the fault of the monitor that I'm looking at, the shadow areas seem a little heavy. I like the lighting idea that gives some tremendous feel, and the layout of the elements in the picture work together nicely and tell a story. One thing, as I look more at it, I wonder if the photographer could not have backed off just a little bit and shown more of the book and completed that story that way. And then finally, our first place image is titled Attitude. It scored a 14, and this was an image by Ernie Tasic. Very well composed picture. The background has been handled very nicely. The railroad tracks receding into the background, and our lighting is concentrated in the area of the model, which I like. That's some beautiful pair of boots too. I just have to say those are marvelous. One thing that kind of bothered me was some of the graffiti on the bridge, and I think with a little bit of darkening of those areas, those could have been toned down a little bit. Perhaps a tonal value similar to the background, I think, would have brought the viewer's attention back to the model and not to the graffiti on the bridge. But very well done, nice placement of the model, beautiful lighting, just a well presented picture. And finally, we have to make our selection for the best of show. This was a difficult task. I thought there was some excellent pictures from all four categories, with the picture Attitude, A Pacific Moment, Waiting to Ride, and Splash and Dash. And I had to really look at these pictures, all four of them together, individually, and I had to make my decision based upon several elements. And the one element that I found that was perhaps the greatest one was overall impact, and that was the image titled Splash and Dash by Don Champlin. I felt this was, it was a tough choice to make, but the picture was sharp and it just had an awful lot of impact. And it was a very difficult choice to make. So I hope everyone was pleased with my comments, pleased with the results of the scores, and it was a pleasure once again for me to judge and comment on the images from the Plano Photography Club. Thank you once again. Good night.